Welcome to Today, Tomorrow, and the Long View, a podcast series with UMB Bank that will explore the financial side of agribusiness, asking the important questions farmers need to consider for their financial well-being. I'm your host, Megan Grebner, and throughout this series we've been talking with several experts at UMB Bank who provide insights into this important aspect of farming life. Today, in person, we are talking with Lance Albin, Bill Watson, and Michael LaPlante at UMB Bank here in Kansas City about the kinds of conversations farmers and producers should be having with their banks as we wrap up this harvest season and start planning for planting season 2020. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
All right, so to get things started, I'm going to toss you a softball, and we'll leave it up for grabs. Where are we right now in agriculture, and what are some of the things that we're thinking about, or you guys are thinking about, when it comes to the banking perspective?
You bet. So 2019 in general has been a decent year for the farm economy. We've had pretty good yields. We've had prices move around a lot, but the prices available today are okay. The market facilitation program, the MFP payments, have been a big boost for net farm income, which the USDA is projecting to be actually the best year in 2019 in the past 4 years. So that's certainly a positive. But that's not been necessarily distributed evenly per se. So that program has had a huge impact on net farm income, but it depends really drilled down on a county level basis what farmers have received from that program. The livestock markets have been fairly volatile. The cattle market has been down and is now rebounding. Milk prices have been down and now rebounding. So it really depends on which segment of ag we're talking about. But in general, things have held together fairly well in 2019.
So from the standpoint of the longer view, we're coming out of 5, maybe 6 years here of very stressed financial performance on the farm, based on low commodity prices, based on people positioned 5 years ago for growth and expansion that hasn't happened. And so while this year has been better, we still have an awful lot of farmers out there that are struggling financially because of the impact of the last 5 years of stress on cash flows, inability to market their crops at a price that really shows a profit level. And so there's still a lot of recovery that needs to take place as well.
I think it's interesting too when you look at, you came into 2019, we've had a few years of the stressed farm economy. You add global trade issues, lower commodity prices, pressure on the soybean side of things, and then you throw in the weather of this year. So obviously we don't take this year, maybe we keep this year as an anomaly weather-wise, but how does that come into things from a financial and banking perspective, looking about managing those budgets and those types of issues for next year?
Yeah.
You know, Megan, I guess from a budgeting standpoint, I think in 2019, 2020, given the low commodity prices, it's even more so important to have that continuous open line with your banker. We need to be openly discussing from a budgeting, cash flow, marketing standpoint, and even more so during these challenging times. The way that we approach from our meetings, we like to at least have a minimum of 3 face-to-face meetings throughout the year, to where you actually put the pen to the paper and work through the numbers. And obviously we're having ongoing conversations with our producers throughout the years, but the initial meeting that we like to have is typically in the first quarter of the year, heading into the current year marketing program. And at that point, we like to really kind of work through, crop projections. Bankers can provide a lot of guidance, advice, some added value during that process. And then we also, mid-year is a very important time to really sit down with your banker. At this point, you're leading into harvest. You have a general idea where your expenses are at, the quality of your crops. It's important to put together a fall harvest cash flow. This is a very useful tool, as it allows you to see the cash inflows and outflows. And at this point in time, you'll have a pretty good idea if you could potentially be looking at a shortfall in cash flow. And it's obviously an important time to bring up to your banker to really kind of set a game plan to really work through that challenging cash flow. And then, the final meeting would really, obviously after harvest, to recap to see the performance of the farm, any concerns the producer might have, and also, again, start talking about the following year. And so I think, it's very important to have that open dialogue. Solid relationships are built on honesty and transparency, and obviously those go hand in hand. And it's even more so to have the willingness to communicate during the good times, but also these challenging times that we're in. And with those factors, if you add them all, you'll have a very solid relationship, and all those are very critical factors to having that. So
I think it's got to be a difficult conversation to have. I mean, if you're looking at a year like this, to sit down with your baker, what happens if you just say, I can't do it? Like, what do we do at that point?
That's a difficult conversation to have. And, what we like to have these conversations before we get to that position. I understand a lot of it's hard to foresee in the future and whatnot, and that's why it's important leading into harvest to really kind of put together your fall harvest cash flow, and that will give you a general idea if cash flow is going to be tight. At that point, there's enough time that the banker, the producer can really work together to work through that. So it's definitely important to have that open line of communication throughout the year, but especially important, leading up to harvest, during those critical times.
So I think, the question of somebody saying I can't do it, frankly, that's happened over the last several years. Sometimes people really mean it. Sometimes it's just an expression of almost panic. And as Michael was saying, having the candor and the relationship with the borrower so you can sort of walk through what's going on and what's the path. A lot of times, farmers, like all human beings, have a tendency to freeze when they get concerned about things, and that's rarely a good solution. Typically, a much better solution is for those folks to have a discussion about what their options are. In this last 5 years of tough cash flows, an awful lot of people have had to transition from the mindset of, well, just wait for prices to go back up. That was certainly kind of the approach people took in 2015 and 2016, just wait and it'll come back. Well, that hadn't happened, and so just waiting isn't the answer either. It's taking a look at assets. It's taking a look at, if this operation won't work in this configuration, how will it work? Because the fact is that an awful lot of our customers and friends on the farm, if you really want to understand what they really want in their heart of hearts, they want to farm next year. They want to be on the farm next year with their families, doing what they love to do. And so part of our job is trying to help them find a way to do that. And it's not always easy, and it's not always comfortable, but having those discussions is critical, because if you freeze or if you don't take some of those options, then your options get worse and worse as you move through time.
So we've talked about this prolonged period of lower grain prices. We see potential positivity looking ahead to 2020 if we get a trade agreement in place with China and some of those other things. What are some other things that could change, that could maybe change the direction and maybe shift the market higher?
So a few things that might lead to higher grain prices specifically. One would be, which you've already referenced, would be a resolution with China on the trade issues. Another might be, we don't know yet, we don't have final numbers on the 2019 U.S. crop. So right now the USDA is projecting 167 bushels per acre for corn, 46.9 bushels per acre for soybeans. So there's a reasonable chance that that the final numbers in the final USDA report could come in lower. That would certainly move markets meaningfully higher, in my opinion. Lower production in other key world markets would also be beneficial for our prices. Certainly, Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine clearly would. Any lower production numbers there would clearly aid global commodity prices. And then finally, and this is probably more in play than it has been recently, a weakening of the U.S. dollar would certainly help grain prices. So we've had a few Fed rate cuts here recently, and our rates have now moved a bit lower. So that could translate into a lower dollar, which would then translate into possibly higher commodity prices. So there are a set of factors of which, if any of them were to come to fruition, it would certainly help grain prices in the United States.
Is that trade component really important? I mean, when we think about it, we hear us talk about it a lot. But for farmers and ranchers, when they hear about it, should they realize how vital that is to their prices and what they do as well?
I think they do. I think that that the people on the farm understand that we are a juggernaut in terms of agricultural production in the world. And the fact is that through our technology, through our seed technology, through our equipment, utilization of technology, we're producing more and more and more product every year on the same number of acres, and some cases on fewer acres. And the fact is, you take that increased production and those numbers and overlay a fairly slower growth rate in terms of population. And that means we have products that we have to move out of the country. We have to have other markets. And so when anything disrupts the market flow, whether it's weather or trade disputes or anything, it changes the outlook and eventually the price, either for the better or for the worse.
Let's talk about steps. We know some of these conversations are tough, but what steps can farmers and ranchers consider to adjust in these times of lower profit levels that we're currently seeing?
So a few things I might mention: if you're, on your farm or ranch, if you're experiencing cash flow shortfalls, not able to make payments, not able to make ends meet, coping also with higher living expenses, perhaps. A few things to consider. One would be just to reduce overall leverage. So in the good times, maybe you had an asset that was not that productive, but you kept it around, or you kept an underperforming portion of your farm around. The interest expense paid on those items maybe wasn't that big of a deal because the profits were robust in other parts of your farm. So reducing overall leverage, saving those interest dollars is probably important, especially if they're non-productive assets, or they're not earning a fair return on what they cost or on your effort involved. Also, a thing to consider, and this has happened in the past few years, and you want to be careful to not make this a recurring thing, but I guess I would call it moving debt down the balance sheet. So maybe replenishing working capital, eliminating some equipment payments by refinancing some debt on land, reduces cash flow requirements and could even save some interest expense given how flat the yield curve is. So that's something certainly to look at, but again, that's something you don't want to make a habit of, or the land just remains always leveraged up. And then the next thing I'd share is maybe just the thought that you'd make each farm stand on its own. And this is where it becomes important to know which farms are your most productive, most profitable farms, and concentrating resources and attention on those farms to do even better there. And then looking at, if there's a farm that you're renting and the rental agreement's not favorable, or that farm's not producing a fair return, again, for the investment dollars employed or your efforts, to let that farm go. Right now is the time to be laser focused on what works and to let things that aren't working go. And then lastly, and this is sometimes a tough conversation, but people who've engaged in this have found it to be, one, financially beneficial, and then sometimes also have found it to be just a good counterbalance for the work that's done on the farm, is to consider a side gig. Lots of our farmers, ranchers, they're very skilled in lots of different things, whether it be in mechanic work or marketing or understanding a number of different aspects of business. They can do a side gig that generates a decent amount of income that can help bridge the gap of the cash flow shortfall that the farm might be experiencing right now.
Does it also mean not keeping those emotional attachments to acres or to farms maybe that aren't as profitable?
I grew up farming, and so I know what it is to have rented a farm for generations, and it becomes something that's very close to you and your family. Well, we've always farmed that, and we call it this name that maybe it was called generations ago, that piece of land, and so there's certainly an emotional attachment there. But right now, it's probably more important to reference Bill's point to get to farm another year than to hang on to those things that have been historically important to the family.
It's not about taking the path that you like a lot it's about taking the path that will lead you to survival and to staying on the farm, and picking the lesser of the undesirable choices.
How is UMB Agribusiness unique in how your team of ag lenders navigate the current economy with your farmers and ranchers?
So I guess 3 words come to mind, and we pride ourselves on these 3 words and UMB Agribusiness, but in all of UMB as a whole. So those 3 words are nimble, flexible, and responsive. Nimble meaning we can adjust and we can move quickly. Flexible meaning we don't think everything has to be a cookie cutter deal. We want to look at your operation, at your farm or ranch or your agribusiness, and we want to tailor solutions that fit perfectly for you. And then lastly, responsive. So we pride ourselves on getting back to people quickly. We want to be accessible and available for our customers and for our prospects. So nimble, flexible, and responsive.
Michael, you're out there with our customers an awful lot in the field. So what do you think sets us apart?
You know, I would say one of the main factors, what Lance just mentioned regarding being nimble, you know, we're able to obviously move quickly for our customers, which is very important in ag, especially during harvest season. Another aspect of it is just, you know, more of that, I consider it really more of a super community bank feeling. You know, we're large enough to handle 99.9% of all of our customers' needs, but really small enough to get at the dinner table to really sit down and understand their operation. And that is even more so important right now during these challenging times from the banking side, but also from the producer standpoint. They like to be with a bank, obviously, that truly understands their operations, understands the challenges that they are going through right now. And you know, that really has set us apart. But also another aspect of it is we understand that producers do not work 8 to 5. We understand time is difficult. And what we try to position ourselves is, you know, if we need to be on the farm before you actually go out in the field or after you come out of the field at night, you know, we will adjust our time to meet your standards on that end. A lot of banks are typically 8 to 5 in that nature, and obviously we do not operate like that. We mirror our time, adjust it to how the producers are, and that coupled with just the willingness to work through the understanding through the challenging times has really kind of set us apart, and obviously been able to remain nimble during these challenging times as well.
You know, I think that one word that really comes to mind to me in terms of how we're different is the word listen. I think that we go the second and third mile to take the time to understand what it is our customers need, what it is they want, and many times what it is they fear. We also are insistent on having a relationship that's a two-way street. Like a good friendship or a good marriage, it requires both sides to be candid with each other. It requires both sides to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. What we found through 5 very challenging years in agriculture is that if we're being candid with each other, if we fully understand the assets that we have to deal with and the resources, that we can find a path through this, but only if we're listening. If we're listening to them and if they're listening to us. And I think that's a lot different than many of our competitors who are, I think, trying to take a customer's needs and fit it into an existing box. And I don't think that box exists. I think every customer is unique, has a different set of assets and resources and abilities, and we need to be candid with each other about whether those assets and resources and abilities will fit into a model that will let them stay on the farm and eventually bring them to a profit level that helps them prosper.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Any closing thoughts, maybe some final thoughts looking ahead to 2020 as we wrap up today? We'll start with you.
Well, I consider, you know, I think 2020, there could be some potential changes if we see, you know, resolution, obviously, with the trade war with China. I think it's important to remain conservative, develop a marketing plan early in the year, stick to that marketing plan, make an individual accountable for it. Again, you know, there's potential we could see rising commodity prices. However, I think it's important to, you know, focus on hitting singles and doubles instead of home runs right now. So,
have a budget, understand it, make sure your banker understands it, and make sure you have the cash available to be able to grow your crop or raise your animals correctly. If you run out of cash halfway through the game, you're not going to get to the end of it.
So I'd just say UMB's bullish on agriculture. We're bullish on agriculture because we're bullish on the people involved, and we're bullish on the long-term trends. So we don't respond or get worked up about day-to-day gyrations of commodity markets, because we're committed to this business. We're committed to the people in it, and we feel there's a great opportunity for us to continue to grow and to distinguish ourselves as a bank that is nimble, flexible, and responsive. So we look forward to serving our customers and meeting new prospects in 2020 and beyond.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As you just heard from the UMB Bank Ag team, there are many financial decisions to be made as we finish out 2019 and head into 2020. To learn more about how financial experts at UMB can help with the planning and preparation during times like these, visit umb.com/agribusiness.